When God created man, he made many different types of people. Among these were the Pamiri. And when God felt it was time to distribute his land among his creations, he told them to line up. The Pamiri, not being aggressive, were pushed to the back of the line. God went down the line allotting people land, and when he reached the end of the line in the Pamiri, he realized he had left no land for them to live on. God felt bad, so he gave them the land he was saving for his personal garden. Thus, all of the people were taken to their respective territories by angels, and the Pamiri lived in God's garden happily. As people migrated into the region that we modernly consider as Tajikistan, they brought along with them sheep and goats that they herded. They also farmed wheat and barley. These people centralized around a few urban centers, and stayed very secluded. Then, for a while, new settlers halted. This would come to be known as the Oxus Civilization, which would go on to form a hierarchical society with fairly large cities. Due to the seclusion of the territories, the people there used very basic technologies compared to the rest of the world at the time. They were introduced to these technologies when a group of migrants came from the Iranian region en masse. This wave of Iranian immigrants most importantly introduced metallurgy to the region, which the Oxus honed and refined into their own style that they used for trade and to show prestige. This area became quite a large trading hub, with access to Iran, Pakistan, India, and China. At the same time, the Oxus began to build formidable walls around their major cities. The Oxus civilization eventually collapsed, but the exact reasoning is unknown. One theory is that nomads arrived in the region with horse-drawn chariots, and they used this unheard-of technology to topple the civilization through force. These people were known as the Citians, and they ruled over the region for some time, but either left the region because of its lack of population, which allowed for small independent communities to form, or small independent states broke away from the larger Scythian empire. Either way, small independent states appeared, which were absorbed into the larger Median Empire. But very soon after, the Median Empire was taken over by the Achaemenid Empire. You'll find this as a common theme that Tajikistan once again changed hands. Although, no fighting ever reached the territories that we modernly consider as Tajikistan, since, as the Achaemenids marched on the capital of the Median Empire, the Medians capitulated, giving all of their lands to the new empire. This new rule introduced a form of monetary trade to the region, based in coins, rather than bartering. It also formed the province of Sogdiana that had its own standing army, part of which fought alongside Xerxes in his invasion of Greece. Once this province was formed, the Bactrians and the Sogdians were placed within the same borders, which led to a melding of the two cultures. After a while, the province gained partial independence to provide a buffer state between the Persians and the Scythians, who conducted constant raids from Siberia. This forced Sogdiana to become a heavily militarized society. Now, Alexander the Great, leading a Greek army, began to conquer the Persians in return. And once he reached Sogdiana, he began to attack its largest fortress, the Rock of Ariamazes. In this fortress was a local nobleman's daughter, who Alexander would take as one of his wives once the stronghold was overtaken. This woman would bear a child to be the heir of Alexander the Great. There were many revolts across the state, and some Sogdian generals even turned to alliances with the neighboring Scythians to try to remove the Greeks from their region, although to no avail. As many of Alexander's men married locals in prevention of further revolts, the culture became very Hellenized. These marriages had the intended effect, and the province was subdued. Once Alexander died, his newly born son and his mentally ill brother were the only heirs to his throne, and as both were incapable to rule, a regency was implemented, and lands were divided among generals. Sogdiana was given to the general Stasinor, but in a civil war, these lands were engulfed into the Seleucid Empire. This was short-lived, as the governor of the eastern provinces broke away to form the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Around this time, the Chinese sent expeditions into Central Asia, where they met with the Greco-Bactrians. Here they saw a state with goods from east and west, which prompted the creation of the Silk Road. Eventually, Sogdiana broke away from the kingdom, as the Greco-Bactrians were distracted fighting Indian nations, but the state was almost immediately dissolved, as Scythians from Siberia and Yuezhi from western China flowed into the region, being chased from their former homelands and overrunning the locals. In this time, the Silk Road became a major trade route, and the people of Sogdiana based their lives around trade. Many trading posts were erected to aid traveling merchants. The Sogdians were important to the Silk Road, as they were the crossroads between China and Western Asia. The Yuezhi people of Bactria began to form the Kushan Empire, which would vastly expand into northern and central India, and would become one of the most powerful nations of the time, alongside the Roman Empire. The Kushan Empire would lose control of Sogdiana and Bactria to the Kittites, who invaded from the north. This kingdom would become a vassal to the Sassanids, and eventually incorporated into the empire. Under the Sasanians, the people of the region would be hired as mercenaries to fight the Romans, and would be involved in battles such as the Siege of Amida. The Sogdian lands would be seized by the Hephthalites, a nomadic Hunnic tribe who killed the Sasanian king in an ambush. The Hephthalites would continue into Sasanian land, eventually making Persia its tributary state. Unwilling to be a tributary state, the Persians allied with the Gokturks, another Hunnic tribe, to defeat the Hephthalites, and they were successful. The Gokturks had a long-standing rivalry with the Chinese Tang dynasty, who invaded them soon after. The Chinese for a short time held control over Tajikistan. This is until the Gokturks rebirthed their empire from ruins and retook the territories. But by this time, in the Middle East, there was the Umayyad Caliphate. The Caliphate began warring with these Huns and took control of Tajikistan, although soon after, the Umayyad Caliphate would give way to the Abbasid Caliphate, who would spread Islam to Central Asia, as the rulers wanted unity among their people. For their loyalty, 4 grandsons of the founder of the Abbasid Caliphate were given lands in Central Asia. Together, these grandsons united their power to form the Samanid Empire, as an independent kingdom from the Abbasids. Although the Samanid Empire found initial success, they were obliterated by the people of the steppes. And after the fall of the empire, Tajikistan simply became a borderland of constant raids and battles between the Karakanid and the Ghazvanid Huns. The Tajik lands changed hands 3 more times, between the Seljuk Turks, the Ghurid dynasty, and following them, the Khwarezmian dynasty. The Mongol Turks, a rising power in the east, sent an envoy to the Khwarezmian dynasty, offering an alliance and trade relations. The dynasty simply killed these envoys. So, the Mongols invaded and took control over the lands of Tajikistan. Since by this time, some of China had been subjugated by the Mongols, there were many specialists in their army, some of these being gunpowder specialists who introduced firearms to the region. Once Genghis Khan died, his lands were divided among his sons. His son Chagatai was given a khanate in Transoxiana. This state was sent spiraling into a civil war between East and West Chagatai. In the midst of this civil war, a new nation took over West Chagatai, called the Timurids. These people held control of Central Asia for a long while, until they were attacked on all sides by their neighbors. The Khanate of Uzbeks to the north conquered most of Central Asia, and once established there, gave the locals their own Khanate, called the Khanate of Bukhara. Peace was achieved for some time, and during this period, literature and art flourished. The Khanate of Bukhara became the Emirate of Bukhara, with a change in rule to a Muslim-based monarchy. The British in India began close ties with the Emirate to provide a buffer state between India and the Russians, who had been conquering much of Siberia. But the Bukharans had tendencies to send raids against the Russians, which provoked them into war. The Bukharans lost the war after a series of 3 sieges, and were put into the Russian province of Turkestan, which encompassed most of Central Asia. There was a lot of discontent in the region towards the Russians for a variety of reasons, such as, but not limited to, a railroad being built, causing an influx of Russian settlers to try to Russify the newly conquered lands, and a new need for cotton due to the Americans being caught in a civil war. So, vast expanses of Central Asian land were given to Russian cotton farmers. The real nail in the coffin pushing the Tajiks over the edge was the changing of conscription laws to include Muslims during World War I. This caused a mob to form in Kujand, which attacked several Russian officers. From here, widespread revolts occurred all across Turkestan, which were initially successful due to the Russians being busy fighting the Germans. But some 30,000 troops were diverted from the front line to quell the rebellion. Due to the revolt sparking from a general hate for the Russians, with no centralized operation, it took quite a while to suppress. But eventually the superior firepower and numbers of the imperialists proved victorious. This victory wasn't enjoyed by the Russians for long, as, inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution, the people of the region united to form autonomous Turkestan, which was promptly invaded by the Bolsheviks, who went on a killing spree to try and destroy the movement in its cradle. These killings had the opposite effect and only heightened the popularity of the movement, which was rebirthed when the Soviets employed conscription to the region. But this only led to a few battles and a defeat. After their defeat, many Tajik supporters of this movement fled to Afghanistan, and many died in various conflicts, which left most of Tajikistan's lands uninhabited. Originally, the Tajik state was a part of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, but was given the status as its own SSR, with its capital around the city of Dushanbe, or renamed Stalinabad after the General Secretary at the time, Joseph Stalin. This is where we see the first instance of the modern borders of this nation arise. Also, many improvements technologically. But it wasn't all good, as purges and deportations ravaged the Tajiks, who were subsequently replaced with Russian settlers in another attempt at Russification. The Tajik SSR was one of the least advanced SSRs industrially, and suffered from very low development. It didn't help that 20% of its population would be drafted to fight in World War II, and half of these soldiers would not return home. Following Stalin's death, Stalinabad was renamed Dushanbe in an effort to de-Stalinize. At the same time, the SSR was directly affected by the Virgin Lands campaign, which attempted to increase farming lands across the Soviet Union. Due to this campaign, the Tajik SSR was given an extra 50,000 hectares of land from the Uzbek SSR, and many dams and pumps were built, as a major problem for agriculture in the region was a lack of access to water. Besides this, in the Tajik SSR, living conditions and education rates remained abysmally low, and Russians controlled every level of their government. A general discontent brewed among the Tajik people towards communism, and as the USSR began to collapse, many of the Tajik people took to the streets against the communist rulers. These protests proved successful, as the Supreme Court of the Tajik SSR declared Tajikistan independent from the Soviet Union. This allowed for the suppressed Tajik language to be spoken freely, and for the Tajik people to have a say in their government. This joy didn't last long, as many Soviet officials stayed in power after the transition away from the USSR. Thousands of Islamists and supporters of liberalism began protesting their government. Most of these protesters held varying allegiances, and wanted their own governmental reforms to be implemented. So, when fighting broke out between the government and the people, fighting also broke out between the various protesting groups. Some of the more extreme groups even began killing civilians who didn't share the same ideology. This led to a mass exodus of groups, mostly Jews and Russians, fleeing persecution. Russia, seeing one of its former subjects having its people fight for a potentially anti-Russian government, sent troops to aid the Tajik government. This did little though, as the civil war reached a stalemate. Violence would be partially halted when the UN intervened and began peace talks between the two sides. This allowed for a temporary ceasefire to be signed. General peace would be maintained until a new government would be established. Soon after, Tajikistan would reach an agreement with the USA to allow for American troops to pass through and station in Tajik lands in the American invasion of Afghanistan. Despite UN intervention, subsequent elections have all been internationally deemed as unfair in their results, as the party from before the Civil War has consistently been elected into government. This party is highly pro-Russian, and has allowed for the Russian military to retake control over a former Soviet base. And corruption is obviously rampant, as an armed attack on a government building was used as a scapegoat to block the official opposition party of Tajikistan from government. And that is the state of the nation of Tajikistan.